Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Timothy Miller.
Hi there, how are you doing today?
Doing excellent. How are you doing, Molly?
I am doing great. So, can you tell me about what you've written?
Yes, this is my debut novel. It's called The Strange Case of Eliza Doolittle. And basically, if you've seen Pygmalion or its musical version, then you know that it's the story of how Henry Higgins takes a girl of the streets and turns her into a facsimile of a duchess. But in my story, Pickering, whom he is bet with on this occasion, has his reservations. As a matter of fact, he thinks that perhaps Eliza Doolittle may have been switched out and that Eliza may have even been murdered. So he calls on his old friend, Dr. John Watson, who calls on his old friend, Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson go undercover in Higgins' house, as Sherlock as a American gangster and Watson as his English secretary, to discover whether she is indeed Eliza Doolittle or somebody else. And they find out some very interesting things which almost get them killed several times.
I think it's so fascinating how you blend together these two worlds. Can you tell me a little bit about the process of combining like Pygmalion and Sherlock?
Well, really, I mean, the way this came about originally was I was teaching English in Milan, Italy, and I wanted to teach them a little bit about English prepositions because Italians have like 6 prepositions. In English, we have about 100.
Oh, there's so many.
And so I decided to write them a little story with leaving all the prepositions out. And I wanted some English characters that would be well known even to Italians. And, since I was going to write a detective story, of course, Sherlock Holmes left to mind. But then I pulled some more out of the air, including Henry Higgins and Eliza Doolittle and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I wrote this little story, and it was a great success, and that was it. I didn't intend to do anything else with it. But over the years, I started thinking about why I had selected these particular characters and what Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson had in common with Higgins and Pickering, and what Eliza Doolittle might have in common with Mr. Hyde. So really, the only thing to do was to bring them into Higgins' household in 1912, which is a little bit past Sherlock Holmes' time. As a matter of fact, he comes out of retirement for this story, and a little bit out of his era, which is really the Victorian era, and Higgins and Doolittle exist in the Edwardian era.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that it was just something that you were doing for a class, and then it spawned into this whole novel.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite of the 3 stories that you combined?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I would say probably Pygmalion, My Fair Lady, because it really examines a very important thing that was happening in Edwardian England at the time, which was a fluidity of character, a changing of character. In the Edwardian era, everyone was what they were born into. And that's why Sherlock Holmes was so good at figuring out every man's occupation, because every man's occupation and place in life and station in society did not change. Mm-hmm. But suddenly, with the death of Victoria and the accession of her son, Edward, things did begin to change. And personality became a lot more fluid. And I think that's really, very well captured in Pygmalion by this young girl who wants terribly to be a girl in a flower shop, which up until that time was impossible. But now she sees a way and she's gunning for it.
Yes. Something really interesting that you do in your book is show how the time has passed. As you said, he comes out of retirement and, like, certain people are dead and, like, certain people are, like, in and out of their lives. Like, they live in different areas. And how did you figure out, like, oh, I feel like this would be a natural progression of things that would happen for Sherlock?
That's a good question. I definitely didn't want to locate the story at 221B Baker Street. I wanted to rid myself of a lot of that baggage, because it can be comforting to an audience, but it can also be a little stultifying. So I wanted him to be in a completely new area of his life. And, he's down in Sussex keeping bees, which was always his lifelong dream for some reason, which is impossible to figure out. Mm-hmm. So certain characters were necessary and others were important to understand where Sherlock Holmes is and where Dr. Watson is, because really you cannot separate the two. Without Watson, there is no Holmes, or at least there is no mystery to Holmes, because we only see Holmes through Watson's eyes.
Yes, definitely. So do you have a favorite adaptation of any of the three stories?
Well, I mean, as far as Holmes pastiches, my inspiration was definitely the 7% Solution by Nicholas Meyer. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but in the story and in the movie, Holmes is tricked by Watson into meeting with Sigmund Freud to cure his cocaine addiction. And at the same time, he becomes embroiled in a plot to kidnap La Dama Camellia. And the book and the movie are both so rousing and so full of intrigue that it really opened my eyes to, what you could do with Sherlock Holmes. And with that, I started writing actually a totally different book, which would be my second book, because at the time I couldn't write it because I didn't understand the role of Watson in any Sherlock Holmes tale.
Can you share with me a little bit about what the second book is going to be?
Well, it's about a rather obscure Dutch painter at the time, in 1890, who, according to the police, shot himself and was in France at the time. His name was Vincent van Gogh. And Holmes, who is on another assignment, takes a quick look around and realizes that there's no way he could have shot himself. So he investigates along two lines, one of which is a massive art forgery ring, but the other is to find out who killed Vincent van Gogh.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so fascinating.
That's already lined up with 7th Street to be published next year.
I am so excited to read that one once that comes out. Oh, sounds incredible. So actually, can you elaborate on this a little bit more? You were writing about, like, the death of a very real person. How did you kind of figure out like the right balance between history and fiction?
A lot of research, and a lot of obscure research, because almost every character in that novel is actually a real character who really existed. But I had to make several leaps. I had to involve the French scandal about the Panama Canal, which, of course, the French originally were going to build the Panama Canal. I had to examine all of the different impressionistic painters at the time and all of the people around Vincent van Gogh, because I had to discover, well, if he was murdered, then why was he murdered? Because, normally man is murdered for his money. Well, he didn't have any money, and he didn't really have any enemies. So what in the world could he have been murdered for? And that's where the whole plot about the art forgery comes in, and certain characters that were just footnotes in in other books became prime story members. I did also include a cousin of Holmes, who is part of the Verneuil family. As you may recall, one of the few things we know about Holmes is that on his mother's side, he was related to the Verneuil family, which was a huge and very popular family of artists in France at the time. So he's definitely, comfortable in France. But actually, Watson is not included in this story.
Oh.
But I have another Watson character who's very important for the Morelli method, which was really possibly my first inspiration for the story, was reading about Morelli and the way he revolutionized art attribution and discovery of forgeries. So Morelli was really a sort of Sherlock Holmes of the art world. And I have one of his acolytes as my Watson character.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you had to strike the right balance in his personality so that way he could play off of Sherlock?
Yes, I mean, he knows a little bit about Sherlock Holmes, but it's a very new thing for him to actually be exposed to him. And at the beginning of the book, he doesn't really care for him at all. He thinks he's crazy. But he's willing to go along with whatever he says because of his mentor, Morelli, is friends with Sherlock Holmes. And so he goes along and does his job, which is to discover forgeries. But at the same time, he slowly gets to know and to trust Holmes and to see that his views are important, and finally becomes very important into Holmes actually solving the mystery.
So cool.
Because there's a very important question of forgeries which comes into it at the end. And I won't say any more about what he does about the forgeries, but...
oh yeah, we don't want to spoil anyone. So... did you have to do any research? And if so, like, what kind for your novel, The Strange Case of Eliza Doolittle? Because that's so many different characters bringing together.
That was a little different kind of research. I mean, normally I have to do a huge amount of research for, like, I'm doing a third Holmes novel right now, which is taking an immense amount of research. But in this case, it was more inserting research. It was like, I had the questions that the story brought up and had to insert a particular bit of history. For instance, I very much wanted a figure from the nobility to be interested in Eliza Doolittle as his wife. And I hit the books, and I found out that the Prince of Bavaria, his wife, had just died. And so his attaché, Colonel von Stetten, becomes a very important character in the book. But even with small things like in one portion, I have Holmes, he needs to be delayed on a train. And I thought, okay, well, the train is going by Oxford, so maybe the Oxford boat race would delay his train. And then I found out, no, the Oxford boat race was a different time of year. So I looked and finally came up with a plane crash that happened just near Oxford right at that time. And I thought, okay, the whole countryside, because this is a plane crash in 1912. So, they didn't have too many plane crashes. And so this would rouse up the entire countryside and delay his train. So it's that kind of thing where I was like, working a jigsaw or working a crossword puzzle to satisfy the concreteness that I needed, even with a story about almost entirely fictional characters.
Yeah. So, pivoting a little bit here, when you were younger, like, were you interested in writing, and what made you want to be a writer?
As soon as I learned to print, basically, when I got out of first grade, I was 6 years old, and I decided to write a novel. I only got about 10 pages of it. It was about my monsters.
10 is a lot for a first grader.
Yes. And someday I may go back to it. Who knows? But, to me, it just seemed that, if you had learned to write, it was like learning to swim. You write. And so that's what I did. I think also I may have been a little bit pushed that way by my mother and my oldest brother and sister, who were incredible storytellers. And they were such great storytellers that you could hardly ever get a word in edgewise with them. So it's possible that I started writing to get my word in edgewise.
That really is so awesome. And I love hearing from authors on here when they're like, because this happens sometimes, I get so many varied answers for that question, but sometimes they're like, oh yeah, it's just been my whole life. And I love hearing that. When you were younger, did you also like reading?
Oh, yes. It was really unfortunate that in about third grade, I read The Wind in the Willows. Mm-hmm. Not because it's still my favorite book, but at the time reading it, I was told, okay, now you can't read those little kid books anymore, because you've read The Wind in the Willows and you can read anything. And I believed them that I could read anything. Once I saw The Sword in the Stone, I checked out Le Morte d'Arthur and started plowing through that. Luckily, my mother never thought that there was anything unsuitable for me to read. So I read everything, and including some of her favorites, especially the Dumas books and the Damon Runyon stories, which she absolutely loved. So I read everything.
Did you have any specific favorite books when you were younger?
Oh, yes. Well, like I say, The Wind in the Willows is still sort of my Bible.
It's so incredible.
And, it's such a gentle book. I mean, I still reread it, at least part of it every year. And actually, it was my introduction to the Edwardian period, since the Edwardian period is really about gentlemen boating down the river and enjoying themselves and having plenty of leisure time. And really, it was my introduction to detective novels because if you'll remember, in the chapter called The Wild Wood, Mole gets himself lost, and then Rat comes and finds him, and they're in the middle of a blizzard, and they're completely lost. And Rat skins his knee. And from that, he discovers that there's a door scraper and a doormat and a door, and Mole is his Watson, just praising him, and he cannot believe it. And of course, they find out that it's the door to Badger's set. And so that's my first introduction to Edwardian detective stories.
That is so cool. I was in a Wind in the Willows play once, a bunch of years ago. But before that, I had read the book and absolutely adored it.
Who were you?
I was Rat. And I have no memory of anything about that play for some reason. But all I remember is that I had a great time and how much I love that story. Do you have any other favorite, classic novels?
Well, anything by Dickens and anything by Dumas. I would say Dickens, especially Our Mutual Friend, just because it paints his canvas so wide in that novel. I mean, it goes from the dustman, who's the basically a garbage man, up to the very elite of society. And it just goes back and forth between them and really ties them all together. And you can really see Victorian society as a whole through that novel. And I guess I would say for Dumas, The Man in the Iron Mask, because it's the closing and shows just how willing each character is to go all for one and one for all.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that you'll ever put any characters from any of those stories into the world of Sherlock or combine anything like that in the future?
It's possible. I mean, there is Inspector Bucket from the Bleak House. I would like to take a crack separately at the Count of Monte Cristo, the years in between his escaping from prison and his returning to society as the Count. I would love to explore his adventures and how he really becomes the Count. But that's a completely separate world.
Yeah. So, on another hand, which character was the most fun to write, and which character was the hardest to write?
I would say Alfred P. Doolittle was the most fun to write. He's really, when Shaw created him, he must have been channeling Dickens because he is a fully Dickensian character, and he's ribald and funny and completely contradictory in every way. So I really enjoyed, although he's a small character in the book, I really enjoyed the time that I had with him. As far as the most difficult character, it was definitely Eliza. Because at the one point I wanted to open Eliza up and let you see more of her history and more of how she feels. But at the same time, I had to keep the mystery of exactly what had transpired with Eliza, whether she is Eliza or whether she isn't. So she was a very delicate balancing act.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, I only have one more question for you today, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Well, of course, I've told you about the strange case of the Dutch painter. I'm working right now on my third and probably final Holmes story, the strange case of the Pharaoh's heart, which has to do with the curse of the pharaohs and examines really what those deaths, because there were about 5 or 6 deaths laid to that curse, and Holmes, who has become a believer in the supernatural, is set to investigate that.
Oh, that sounds so awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Everyone, please go read The Strange Case of Eliza Doolittle and all of the new books coming out. Once again, thank you so much for being on. I had a great time talking to you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
I'm Timothy Miller.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end. Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. This episode is hosted by Molly Southgate. It is edited by Rob Southgate and produced by Southgate Media Group. You can get in touch with the show at readbetweenthelines@gmail.com, or you can send us a voicemail at 708-887-9473. That was 708-887-9473. You can also find us on Instagram at Read Between the Lines Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.